Welcome back to another edition of Things Hidden, our podcast series that we do. It's a deep dive conversation with interesting minds from different perspectives that all contribute to our journey of understanding our current times through the lens of anthropology as well as media. And today is a real a treat because we have with us the leader of the McLuhan Institute, the grandson of Marshall McLuhan, Andrew McLuhan, who's with us now. So thank you for joining me.
Thank you for having me, David. It's a pleasure to be here. How are you today?
Doing well, and looks like you guys are going full steam ahead with what you guys are doing at the McLuhan Institute. And we can get into that. For my listeners, I talk about a concept I call the gospel technology, and that's the idea of using media, and in this sense, more the content of the media rather than just the media ecology like you guys get into, but we can talk about that too. But this idea that we can use media to tell the stories of victims in the same way that the gospel writers tell a victim's narrative, a victim's perspective to a common process that we've seen throughout history, which is when communities are in times of conflict, when scarcity is rife, when tensions are high, when bad blood is running wild, people feel the need to find answers. And oftentimes they find those answers by mimetically, as Rene Girard would say, pointing fingers in the same direction. You know, when we're all pointing fingers at each other, hey, you're mean to me. No, you're mean. But no, you're mean. But no, you're mean. And eventually that gets into aggression. It gets into even violence.
Yeah.
And if that's going all the time, human beings being so mimetic, being so imitational in the way we deal with conflict, the animal kingdom, they have a dominance and submission mechanism. They have this ability to, the wolf, they fight for who's going to be the leader of the pack, and the one who loses submits their neck to the other wolf. Uh-huh. And usually the winning wolf doesn't usually go for the final kill if he can help it. But humans, we're more mimetic than that. We'll go on and on and on and on forever. And that's where we get genocide and, generations of feuding back and forth. But this tendency to have contagious conflict in our ancient past, of course, we found this way to resolve this kind of unconsciously through a scapegoat, through binding together in the mutual exclusion and purging of a common enemy. Mm-hmm. I believe the Gospels are a type of media technology that we can imitate with other types of media to tell the stories of victims so that we can illuminate what we're doing to one another through media, And I hope that perhaps, we can have a conversation where we can learn from the work that you guys are doing at the McLuhan Institute to perhaps aid us in this quest.
Well, I hope so. I find today we're surrounded by sheep in wolves' clothing. A lot of confused people out there as to who's in charge and who's not. Marshall famously said that violence is always a quest for identity. And our technologies commit great violences on us. So it seems like we're in a perpetual state of questing for identity, just as our technologies turn over so fast. Every time we put ourselves on with a new technology, we have to figure out who that person is. And that's why every generation seems so alien to the last. Because we are different people. Our technologies remake ourselves. And so we have to seek to find out who we are again. And no sooner have we maybe gotten an idea of that than we're assaulted again, But the gospel as a technology, there's a lot to that. Each technology presents us with a new opportunity or new opportunities. Especially when it comes to identity and the telling of our stories. Every generation has to recreate Shakespeare. Each new technology is a new opportunity to retell the same old story, but albeit in a different way. Marshall used to tell this joke. There's a couple of goats eating the trash pile out behind a Hollywood movie studio. And the one has managed to find a tasty print of Gone with the Wind. And the other says, "Oh, how do you like that?" He says, "Oh, the book was better." You know, the new things aren't always to the old people's taste, but there you have it. Yeah, this idea of the identity quest, and you're much more informed about Girard and his mimetic desire than I am, but in just looking it up over the last couple days since we talked, I found some curious overlaps. See, Marshall saw this notion of mimesis as a little deeper than simple imitation, but becoming. You know, and this is how he liked to differentiate his ideas on media and technology from the conventional. He said theirs is a transportation theory and mine is a transformation theory. So it's not about necessarily just moving information from here to there and what gets lost in the translation, but who we are at the end, what these technologies do to us, how they change our senses. And he got a lot of his thoughts on mimesis from someone, I'm not sure if you're familiar with the work of Eric Havelock.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so Eric Havelock wrote this book, Preface to Plato. And it's all about the condition of an oral society before the alphabet came along, before the written word. And how it worked is poets would tell their stories to an audience, and the audience weren't just passive listeners, but they became involved to a very deep degree in the story. They became Achilles. They weren't just listening to it, they were Achilles. And that's how years later they could recite the whole thing line for line. Of course, this came at the cost of objectivity. Total involvement, no objectivity. This was the condition before literacy. Literacy came along and it broke this spell of mimesis by providing distance. And in fact, there's a really interesting, my father wrote about the syllogism, which Aristotle invented to break imagistic thinking, right? Before literacy, people thought in images, and you can't syllogize in images. So Aristotle came up with this technology, this device called the syllogism, to basically usher in the age of literacy. Now, the interesting thing is that in post-literacy, we return to more of, not the exact same, but more of the condition of pre-literacy, where now that distance, that objectivity shrinks to barely nothing. And we have a radical identification or mimesis where it's not just imitation, but complete identification. And that's how you can have, for instance, hip hop culture spreading so completely and totally from Philadelphia or New York City to the small town I live in, where people identify so deeply with that culture, they become it. And that is the post-literate condition, I think.
So when did that post-literacy era emerge?
Yeah, it came about with the invention of the telegraph, and the mid-late 19th century. Electricity basically shocked us out of literacy in the electric chair, and took us, in a snowballing way to where we are today.
So can we try to explain this for folks who are, and again, I remember, my first class, and it's cool, I look back, I saw a lecture of your grandfather, Marshall McLuhan, at the University of South Florida in the 70s.
That's a great one.
And that was my alma mater. And I remember my first class there was influencing public opinion. And Marshall McLuhan, I mean, he was like the giant of the textbooks, and the whole department of communication theory was just, really wrestling with his impact.
Mm-hmm.
And I was always intrigued by it, and the way he would play with things, and the way he would the idea of talking about, the Johannine logos of in the beginning was the word, right? And this idea that the word is what constructs us, right? And this, and then,
Yeah.
and
Well,
then,
Marshall was very taken with the word. Words were his business. Um, in the discussion about technology and media, and the medium is the message, it's easy to lose sight of Marshall's own roots in English literature. Marshall was, for his whole career, a teacher, a professor of English, an expert in modernist poetry, Pound and Eliot and Yeats, pardon me. And the fascinating thing, it's still fascinating to me, is that his studies in technology grew directly out of his studies in literature. Essentially, it's a simplification, but basically he took the techniques he learned for studying literature and turned them to studying technology. And the remarkable thing is it worked, right? This is the crazy thing. In fact, in his later work, my father co-authored with him a book called Laws of Media, The New Science. And the basic premise of that book is that all technologies have a linguistic structure. That is, they behave in the same way that words do, words also being a human technology. So it's fascinating to discover that you can learn so much about a computer or a smartphone or anything like that by studying metaphor, for example. I'll never get tired of that and that sense of wonderment.
can you give me a little example of that with the smartphone and metaphor?
Sure. Well, for example, a metaphor is using one situation to understand another, right? And it's a little more than a simile, where a simile is just a comparison. This is like that. We're saying this is that, and actually, that's kind of funny. That kind of relates to mimesis a little bit as well. This idea of mimicking or imitation. In Laws of Media, the New Science, they found out that all technologies manifest the same 4 characteristics. And that's not to say that all technologies only do 4 things, but that all human technologies have 4 things in common. And that is that they enhance or amplify one function. So they speed something up or make it easier. They obsolesce another function. So they take over for something else. They bring back something from the past, which is curious, something that was previously pushed aside. And when you push it to an extreme, to its limits, it flips or reverses its characteristics. So like a highway, for example, is supposed to amplify the speed of traffic. But when you put too many cars on at once, you get a traffic jam. There's that reversal. And where that relates to metaphor is that there's an interesting harmony around the 4 parts, in that enhance is to obsolesce as reverse is to retrieve. And so there's a curious relationship between these 4 things that are present at the same time in a simultaneous kind of relationship. That's the essence of the tetrad in Laws of Media.
So let's go back to that electrification moment where we move into the post literacy era of human experience. What does the experience of the telegraph and the arrival of the telegraph, what does that do to the human person, and what does it do to the human species? What's that like?
It was a very curious moment, in that it allowed for near instant communication across great distances for almost the first time. I guess the previous best would be, semaphore or smoke signals even, which allow you to communicate over great distance, but they're cumbersome. In a semaphore where you're using flags to show letters, it takes an awful long time to spell anything out. A telegraph allowed you to spread messages much more quickly. But it also did something else, which is it took us outside of our bodies. And electricity does that. The way that we're communicating, which if we shut the video off would be essentially a telephone call, meant that our bodies take a bit of a back seat, where we're transporting our thoughts and parts of our being across airwaves and distances. And metaphorically and really, this has big implications for our identity and how we feel about our bodies, because our bodies don't have the same meaning anymore that they do. And so that leads to all kinds of weird things like, tattooing, for example, and body modification, and all these things which seem like an attempt to get back in touch, literally, physically, with our bodies.
But at the same time, we had tattoos in the past, right? So how did that?
Oh, sure. But I don't think they were quite as common or widespread as they are today. Certainly the culture has changed.
So there's a feeling of disembodiment that takes place with the electrification of the human experience, or?
Yeah. When Marshall started to talk about it, he called it angelism, because it put us in a kind of angelic condition where angels are just drifting consciousnesses. They don't have physical bodies. But he moved from that to talking about it as discarnate. I don't know, perhaps to take away the overt theological implications of it. But the essence was that electricity is taking our nervous system and putting it outside our body. And when we're online or on the telephone, our relationship with our bodies is much changed, because we no longer have to be in the same physical space as somebody else. And the curious thing about it is it's a matter of speed more than mass. Online, we can have 1,000 people in a chat room, whereas we could fit maybe 20 people in this room. So it has very great implications for how we communicate and how we feel with each other. It also very much changes our identity. Our identities are so anchored in our bodies, and without a bodily identity to go with it, we can really be anybody without the same sort of consequences.
Yeah, and it's interesting. There's the what's something that's interesting too, not to go too far ahead of where I still want to stay in the beginning of this post-literacy era that you've sketched out for us. But I was just thinking about, what you were saying, the disembodied, the anonymity, the detachment from real identity that the digital age provides. And now it's just strange that we're now in this moment where we're all wearing masks. So it's like that anonymity is now breaking into the physical world. It's like the internet culture of, if you don't know my true identity, I can kind of unleash something on you that you normally wouldn't see me do to you in the real world, but it comes in right when this digital age shows up. Or shortly after, I guess.
Yeah, the mask thing has been a very interesting phenomena, because it used to be that the mask was a sign of subversion, or so like a bank robber, a masked bank robber, or the anti-fascist or otherwise protester seeking to obscure their identity. That has made a total shift, where now the mask is a sign of comfort and safety rather than of threat. I a year and a half ago, I wouldn't have dreamed of walked into my local bank with a mask on. Nothing good could come of that. Now I can't go into my bank without a mask on. That's very interesting. Marshall liked to bring up a quote, "Hypocrite lecteur, mon semblable, mon frère," which is from Baudelaire, and it's talking about the mask reading wearer, and how we put on the identities onto ourselves, how the author puts on the identity of his audience in order to write, and how the audience puts on the characters in the novel in order to immerse themselves in this kind of mimesis in the story. Well, now we're seeing a very overt sign of that. And it's been really interesting to watch people's reactions. And there's a very funny one. I don't know if you must have seen this, but a viral video that went on in Texas. There was an online hearing, and the judge has leaked like 20 seconds of the clip where the poor lawyer didn't check his Zoom filters before he went on, and his child had been on before and had a cat filter. And so here's the lawyer trying to do a serious thing, and he's got a cat face on, and just the anguish, his terror of it. But this is another kind of mask, and it's really interesting that mask filter, even before the pandemic, it had started to become a feature of many social media. I think it started with Snapchat, this idea about the filter and putting on different masks, and now you're a tiger, and now you're this or that and the other. It's really interesting how that is leaking out into, real life, as it were, now. And you're starting to see people doing things with the masks that they wear in public. And pardon me, putting smiley faces or custom printed expressions and things like that, which end up being a little eerie when you look at them.
Yeah, and it's interesting because, Rene Girard talks about the idea of ancient societies creating a lot of rituals and taboos to protect runaway desire, because he saw desire as something that doesn't originate intrinsically in our own hearts like autonomous islands, but rather we catch desire like a disease or a contagion, and this idea that desire possesses us. And that the ancient communities, when you think of desire being something that can be that can spread a lot of bad blood over scarce objects, whether it's a mate or resources or status or what have you, that ancient communities had to find ways to kind of maintain differentiation, to maintain hierarchy and boundaries of self, so that you wouldn't have runaway desire lead to a state of undifferentiated chaos. But they would always have these sacred times where they would allow for people to play act the moment of undifferentiated chaos that they were normally prohibited from ever engaging in. And that's where you get those festivals and carnivals like Saturnalia and so forth, where people put on masks, and they and slaves would swap roles with the master. And you'd be dancing around the campfire, and you didn't know if you were dancing with the mayor's wife. So you didn't, you know what I mean? It was a time in which boundaries were lost. Even the idea of a feast, somebody brought, ham and crackers. The other guy brought a prime rib, and they're all getting to eat from the same table. Those are moments of undifferentiation that if you did that every day could lead to a lot of conflict. And yet they are able to play act that undifferentiation, but it ultimately culminates in a sacrifice. The Saturnalia festival culminated in a sacrifice to the god of Saturn to kind of remind us, like, hey, we've had our fun now. This was a sacred time, but here's how it ends. We have to sacrifice. Somebody has to be giving their skin in the game as a symbol to remind us that we can't do this every day. So we're going to sacrifice this to the gods, which are actually just, in Girard's imagination, just really the crowd projecting their own guilt into a symbolic order. And that from that catharsis, we have that satisfaction, we have that relief, and we go back to the boundaries of differentiation before. So it's interesting with the mass thing. It's like now, instead of it just being a marked out sacred time, it's becoming something that's normal, which is strange because, again, it tends to trigger undifferentiation into eventual sacrifice. And I don't know what this looks like when you're going to normalize this as an everyday thing, perhaps for the foreseeable future, for years to come, perhaps.
Wasn't that interesting? That sounds very smart to me. I think, we all need to let off some steam, that's a cultural pressure valve, right? That's a very ecological and smart thing to do, because either you let off the steam yourself at your chosen time, or you rupture, right? and rupturing doesn't usually work out very well for most of the people involved. I know this in my own life. I used to play with a punk rock band, and as a teenager, or in my early 20s, as somebody, young people tend to have really strong feelings, and they build up, and you need to release them. Punk rock was great for that, because I could plug in and turn up and swear at the crowd through a mic for an hour or something. That was a great thing, right? Yeah, that was very good.
You were performing a scapegoat role in some sense, right?
Right? Yeah.
Like a dunk tank man, like a guy that's hurling insults at the crowd. Come hit the dunk tank, and it's like,
yeah, sure. I suppose the court jester is another kind of relief valve, in a sense. This person that we, the ruler gives license to step outside the normal bounds of what's permissible in order to let off the steam a little bit. And everybody, the clown insults for everybody, so that everybody, doesn't feel they have to. Perhaps that's an interesting idea. Yeah, that idea of desire is interesting, and how we become, why do we desire what we desire? Marshall's interest in technology was in the impact on our sensory lives. And the way the senses work is that when you impact one sense, you impact all the senses, because all our senses, all our bodily senses, are connected. He took a lot of inspiration from a man called Jacques Lucy-Rane. And Lucy-Rane wrote a book called And There Was Light. This was very informative for Marshall, because Jacques Lucy-Rane became blind at a very young age. He's a figure from Paris, from France, who was involved with the French resistance in the World War. In this book, And There Was Light, Jacques Lucy-Rane discusses how, I think it was age 6 or something, he had an accident that affected his eyes, and within a couple of weeks, he was completely blind. The really interesting thing is that he goes on to describe how, when his visual faculty dimmed, his other faculties expanded. And so while he couldn't see things, he had a new sense of sight, in which the rest of his senses, his hearing, his smell, his tactile sense, kind of stepped in to provide a new picture of the relation between things. This is how technologies work. Technologies, particularly our electric and digital technologies of communication, enhance various senses. And by enhancing the one sense, or combination of senses, they change the equilibrium among them. And that's why we find our tastes change, not just our physical taste, like our taste of foods, although that also counts, but for example, musical tastes. This is why Elvis, when he was new, to the previous generation, was an affront, was completely unpalatable, unlistenable. And now people would say that Elvis was cute or quaint. It's hard to imagine that Elvis was kind of the Marilyn Manson of his time. Maybe that's too extreme an analogy, but it's the changing tastes in culture are a sign of the changing technologies, and vice versa. And that has a lot to do with desire. When we step up our visual senses, we desire visual things. When we step up acoustic, we desire the acoustic. We're living very much in a world of the ear right now. And this explains the popularity of things like ASMR, where people are fascinated by somebody coming and scratching on the microphone and talking in very husky tones and doing all kinds of things like this, because it's this kind of reverberation and this high tactility, which feels good to our sensory profiles of the day.
It's interesting, in my own work, when I do a radio show, I put on I modulate my voice,
Yeah.
I do more theatrics. I'm doing a podcast with you, so I'm not talking in the same style. I mean, it's similar, but it's interesting how and I've told people like I cannot do my because when I do my radio entrance, I do a classical, from the heart, that kind of thing. And I'm like,
Okay.
I can't do that if I'm doing a Zoom like with you. I couldn't do from the heart. It just doesn't feel right. But when you're doing radio, you kind of play into that amplification of the ear in the idea of you you want to create this intimate kind of theater experience for the person who's driving in the car, and they're turning on the radio, and the radio provides an environment in which like your online stuff can be tracked by social media and all this stuff, and you don't feel like you have a safe space. But when you're in radio, you can listen to Britney Spears or Rush Limbaugh or NPR, and nobody has to know what your favorite, communicator or song is. And that's a very intimate space. And for some reason, it brings out the desire for me to lean into the performance art of that. But when I'm doing a podcast, I dial it back, and it's just interesting how that works,
Well, part of this has to do with, the amount of information provided or not provided. Marshall, again, talked a lot about participation and hot and cool media, right? And the idea that a technology that supplies a small amount of information has the audience more involved in filling out the picture. So, for example, a comic gives you a low amount of information compared to a film, which is much richer visually than the comic or the cartoon, because a lot happens in a cartoon between the frames that you fill in. Whereas in a movie or a video or digital or even a Zoom call like this, we've left very little to the imagination. Something for the ear, a radio broadcast, leaves a lot more for the imagination, simply because it provides less information, and so it's more involving. I do prefer, I've been running a podcast as well, and I just started an interview series. And although I'm conducting it over Zoom, I'm doing it cameras off, so that it's only for the ear, because it does very much change the quality of the engagement on our side, on the participant side, but also on the user's side as well.
Why?
And you can't fake it either. Like, we could put this, what we're doing, on an audio only podcast, but it would be very different from if we were just having a telephone call.
Mm-hmm.
It'd be hard to run a controlled experiment on that, but it might be.
To see how our conversation would sound and the topics we would raise and the way we would raise them if we did it, recorded it over the phone only versus a Zoom video and audio.
Yeah. Might be worth doing.
Yeah, it would be interesting.
Marshall was all about experimentation. He liked to say, I don't have concepts, only percepts. And he denied being any kind of theorist. Yeah. I just had a chunk of ice fall off my roof. I don't know if you heard that, but Marshall was very practical. It's people are surprised to think, because he gets called a theoretician, but he never called himself a theoretician, or a futurist or a predictor of any kind. He saw himself as somebody who just described what was happening around him. That makes you wonder, especially when people say, wow, he was so prescient. He was describing today 60 years ago. Well, he wasn't. He was describing his present. And where that makes me nervous is if what he was talking about looks to us like today, well, what the heck is going on today that we're missing? That makes me wonder. But he was a very practical person, and he was all for testing things. One of his main distinctions between technologies are on its nature as a light on or a light through. So, for example, our screen, operates by the light coming through to the device onto you, and we're picking up the light, versus a page where the light reflects off, reflected versus refracted, and they have very different effects. In 1967-68, Marshall taught for a year at Fordham University. And when he did that, he brought my father, Eric McLuhan, as well as some colleagues, Harley Parker and Edmund Carpenter and George Thompson, down with him. And they all had a lot of fun teaching classes and seminars and everything. Harley Parker and Eric McLuhan taught a class about the effects of television. And first day of class, they could tell that the class really wasn't buying what they were putting down, you know. So they decided, and they were talking about the differences between television and radio, and television versus film. Where on film, the light comes from behind and hits the screen, whereas in television, the light comes through and hits the audience. So they set up an experiment, and you can look it up online. It's put out there. It's called the Fordham Experiment with Eric McLuhan, Harley Parker. And what they did was they divided the class in half, and they put a sheet down the middle, and they broadcast a film. So half of the class is sitting on my side, on the film side, watching this thing beamed at them. And the other half is sitting on your side, watching it coming through onto them. And they showed a couple of things. One of them was a roller coaster ride. And it's very interesting. I don't remember the whole conclusions off the top of my head, but basically the quality of experience was much different. The people on the film side, as the car is climbing up the hill, the tension builds. It's going slow and slow and slow and slow, and it reaches the peak and then goes over the top. And they found that the people who are on the film side had a much more visceral feeling of the experience than the people on the television side. And that's partly because of the interesting nature of the film is that it's a series of still images that are sped up just fast enough that you don't notice that there's a break between them. Right. But in fact, what's happening is you're filling in that space in between, and you're sensorily highly involved in it. Whereas on a television screen, you're presented with a total picture at all times. Anyway, I'll send you a link, or people in the audience can have a look at that Fordham experiment. But
yeah, that'd be interesting.
The reason I brought it up was simply to illustrate that my father and my grandfather were very practical people that if they had an idea about something, they wanted to test it and see what happened. And you know, it was only it was only kept around as long as it was useful, like the hot and cool thing. It seemed like a really good distinction at the time, but it quickly became not very useful because people got really confused about, well, what's hot and what's cool and what does that mean? And it ended up being more trouble than it was worth.
So what are we in now? Lukewarm?
Right. Well, the hot and cool thing, it's actually really simple. They said a hot medium is any medium that supplies high definition. So the higher the definition, the lower the participation or involvement, the less work the user has to do. When you're given less information, you have to work a bit harder to fill out the picture.
Right.
That's really what it boils down to.
And so, but in this world today, you know, are we in the global village that your grandfather talked about? Is that what he was kind of predicting? This, what is it he called, the electric bride, or am I mixing those two images there?
You're mixing metaphors a little bit. That's okay. Marshall's first well-known work was The Mechanical Bride, the folklore of industrial man. And that was a look at advertising in the age of print, up until pre-television anyway. The global village was a term he used to describe the world we lived in that was brought to us by radio. He later chose a different metaphor for the world after television, which he called the global theater. And in the global theater, there is no audience. We're all participants, everybody is on stage. And that's really borne out today. There's an interesting, I've only seen the preview. It's called Fake Famous, a movie that just came out, a made for TV, which is actually made for internet presentation. It's so hard to know what to call things anymore. We're always a step behind in our terminology. But anyway, Fake Famous, there's a 2-minute intro online you can see, and it's actually interesting. They decided to make some people influencers, right? It's very interesting, but apparently when you ask kids today, and God, don't I sound old, what they want to be when they grow up, they want to be famous. They want to be an influencer. They want to be Insta famous or whatever. And the premise of the movie, as far as I can tell, is that it's ridiculously easy to manufacture fame. And we live in a society where you can buy followers for your social media accounts. You can open a social media account and have 50,000 followers if you've got the money. And the very curious thing, which I've noticed as I've been growing my own social media for the McLuhan Institute, is that there's a certain momentum involved. It's really difficult to grow a social media account up to 1,000 people. But once you get up to around 1,000, it starts to snowball a little bit. And I find my Twitter for the McLuhan Institute is where I've got the most followers at the moment, and that's interesting. But it grows by between 5 and 10 a day, whereas getting those 5, 10, 15, 25, 50, 100 followers was really difficult. Once you start to get them, this kind of critical mass happens and you get more and more and more. So it's interesting that if you have the money to finance it and you can instantly start with 50,000, you can grow a following really quickly. And it has very little to do with merit, which, is what it is. The very interesting parallel there is, and I was struck immediately when I put on this trailer, is they open it up by the writer-director saying to somebody, want to be famous. And this instantly connected with me because there's a very strange but true story about Marshall McLuhan and how we know who he is. Okay. Am I talking too much, David?
No. Keep going. Yeah.
All right. Let me tell you the story real quickly. Marshall McLuhan, as I said, was an academic. He was a literary literature prof. In the 40s and 50s, he was an authority on modernist poetry in North America. He was very well known in academic circles. Then he started to get into the technology stuff. But he really found success in the early mid-1960s. That's when he seemed to go overnight from being a somewhat interesting academic to a media guru, a pop culture phenomenon, a public intellectual. This was not a thing, it is more today, but it's very unusual. The interesting thing is it's not accidental. Marshall McLuhan's fame was somewhat manufactured, which is really interesting. There is a person by the name of Howard Gossage. His middle name was Luck, as it happens, Howard Gossage. And he ran with Jerry Fagan, a marketing and advertising agency in San Francisco. Tom Wolfe wrote about them in his book, The Pump House Gang. They ran their operation out of an old firehouse. Well, as the story goes, and Gossage's wife tells this story in her memoir, Howard Gossage in '64 read Understanding Media. And he got obsessed with it. He was like, this guy knows what's going on, but nobody can understand what the hell he's saying, and nobody knows who he is. He's this academic. Apparently, and this is what happened, Howard Gossage got on the phone and cold called Marshall McLuhan, and he said, Dr. McLuhan, how would you like to be famous? This happened. Marshall, I'm sure, was game, and he said, sure. Marshall was a fun guy. He liked to have fun. So he said, sure, let's do it. Gossage put up, I don't know what it was, a couple grand, flew Marshall down to New York City, and they wined and dined people like Tom Wolfe. And all of a sudden, magazines were putting out articles. Tom Wolfe wrote, "What if he's right? You know, what if he's the most important thinker since Pavlov and Einstein?" And this kind of kicked off Marshall's rapid, almost overnight rise to fame, where in a very short time, it was Marshall McLuhan, everything. He was in Time, funnily enough, not in Time so much. He was in Playboy, he was in the New York Post, he was in the Times, he was in everything, and then around the world. And where that story diverges a little bit from perhaps today's story is in the matter of substance, because Marshall not only had the style, but he had the substance to back it up. This wouldn't have worked with just anybody. Marshall happened to be a highly intelligent, and not just intelligent, but quick-witted. The man was fast on his feet. If you go back and you look at the debate between Marshall McLuhan and Norman Mailer, it's incredible. Marshall had this crazy ability to be able to focus on what he's actually doing, but also pay complete attention to his surroundings and understand the nature of his surroundings and form himself accordingly. So there's this give and take between he and Norman Mailer and the other people that Marshall just destroys, and it's incredible. So this idea of manufactured fame is a very interesting one, and it means something very different today than it did back then, I think.
What led to his kind of going down in terms of the avant-garde nature of his message? What made the mainstream lose interest?
Yeah, Marshall very much fell out of favor. It almost seemed that as quickly as he rose to fame, he descended from it. And what precipitated that? I'm not very sure. He had a lot of,
he said,
right? Kind of. He faced a lot of backlash. He wasn't. His fame was. I'm not trying to be too precious about it. His fame was resented a bit. Back in the '60s, academics weren't TV personalities. You know, it was kind of unseemly. Marshall was always a maverick and a rebel. The nature of his work was interdisciplinary. You know, his work, although it's about technology, about media, it's about the intersection of culture and technology. And technology doesn't stick to, you know, literature or photography or, you know, any category. It covers everything. So Marshall's work was necessarily interdisciplinary. And when he started doing this work in the early 1950s and the late 1940s, the academy was different. It was very, very specialized. It's opened up a lot more, but back then you were expected to have your specialty, your lane, and stay in it. And people didn't welcome, you know, intrusions into their specialties favorably as a general rule. This is a large part of why Marshall wasn't liked very much in academia back then. Maybe the reasons have changed a little bit. Now, interdisciplinary studies is not controversial at all, but it really was then. You know, Marshall's first book, The Mechanical Bride, was a study of advertising and treating it on a level with literature. And that was not done. You know, he got in a lot of trouble for that. In fact, the book never even hit the shelves. It was remaindered before it even hit the shelves, which is interesting. So the decline of Marshall McLuhan in popular culture probably has a lot of causes, but I think part of it was he was so identified with the 1960s. And when the 60s were over, so was Marshall McLuhan. But it's not because he lost his touch. It's easy to say that, but if you look into his work, that doesn't bear out. He did
Did his
some of
work
his,
get darker and more parabolic,
right.
driving the crowds away?
But for example, his work in Laws of Media, this discovery of you know statements that we can say in general about all technology, which is possibly his most important contribution to the field, happened starting in around 1972. The book was published in 1988 by my father, who completed the work. So, Marshall didn't lose his touch, but I think he lost his audience.
I see a lot of parallels with him, with his rise, and it's been mentioned in media for his, uh, you know, uh, parallel pattern with the rise of Jordan Peterson, the psychologist, and
Well,
I've
there,
interviewed Jordan Peterson, and he,
did you?
it's kind of a similar overnight, bam, he's there, and then all of a sudden there's these scandals, and academia doesn't like the fact that he's talking about ideas in the public domain. They're like, no, you're profaning the whole, anybody who's talking to the public isn't really a serious scholar.
It's interesting. McLuhan people don't like you bringing up Jordan Peterson, but there are some interesting parallels. For one thing, they're both from the University of Toronto, which is interesting in itself. Marshall taught 42 years or something at U of T, the vast majority of his career. He started in the States, worked there for close to 10 years in various schools, St. Louis University being the major one, and then came to Canada, was at Assumption College for a year, and then U of T, and he was there for the rest. That's where he started the Center for Culture and Technology. That's where he did all his work. And Jordan Peterson, Peterson comes out of psychology, not literature. And they don't really, Peterson and McLuhan don't really align very much in the nature of their work. Jung is of passing interest in McLuhan's studies. One of Marshall's books, From Cliché to Archetype, does deal with Jung and the archetypes, but it's only works so far. And yeah, exactly. The rise to fame, the disdain or anger of colleagues. I think Marshall handled it possibly better than Dr. Peterson. And at different times, maybe it was easier to handle for Marshall. They had I don't know Dr. Peterson at all. I would love to talk to him sometime. That could be interesting about his work and McLuhan work and where they maybe overlap and maybe where they don't. But, that's fascinating. What did you guys talk about?
It was the day of his book release, 12 Rules for Life in New York City. So we explored that. And again, I'm kind of trying to expand and flesh out mimetic theory and application to our political times. So I kind of engaged correlations and related themes between the anthropology of Girard and some of the things that he was talking about, the idea of the individual versus the crowd and so forth. But speaking of Girard, he had a similar situation too. He was, he was considered like a celebrity in France when he wrote the book Violence and the Sacred. In France, they have a different environment for intellectuals where they treat them like movie stars the way we do over here. And, he was very much a member of fashionable thought when he put Violence and the Sacred out, because he was basically deconstructing religion as a kind of, he was showing that mythology and religion are all basically cover-ups for murder, cover-up for human sacrifice.
Okay.
And, then they didn't like him so much when his next book came out, Things Hidden Since the Foundation of the World, in which he said, well, I came to this idea because of the Gospels. Wait a second. You were deconstructing religion. You weren't supposed to say that you got that from the Bible. You're supposed to go ahead and just gut that too. And it's like, no, it didn't work out that way. And so he became a little bit, and he was also a scandalous to, he was a trained historian, but then he gets into anthropology. He gets into literature. That's where he creates mimetic theories. He looks at all the different novels and he looks for this triangular pattern of desire that he finds within all the best novels. And he looks at he sees, wait a second, rather than the fashionable thing to do was to look for differences, but he saw patterns of similarity. And he said, so maybe there's something about the great literature that the great masters have to basically renounce the romantic lie of the self, that the self, is this, the desires come from the self, and that the great masters of Western literature, they have this moment of kind of conversion where they lose their sense of their autonomous self in the characters and the stories that they write, and they realize the kind of mechanistic patterns of what incites desire in us.
Yeah.
And so he was playing outside of, he was very interdisciplinary and creating a unified theory of social sciences. And he was going way outside the bounds of what you were allowed to do at the time, where it's all about, looking at the granular details and differences rather than looking at the patterns and similarities across cultures and so forth,
Yeah, it sounds like he committed a few of the cardinal sins.
Yeah.
People do not like to be told they're not in control at all. They prefer to think that they are. And it sounds like there's the inconvenient Girard too. There's also the inconvenient McLuhan. People don't like to discuss Marshall's religion and what religion meant to Marshall. And then you have another group of people who place too much emphasis on that. I think there's probably a balance somewhere in between. Marshall didn't like to talk publicly about his faith because he felt it got in the way of conversations. And not that he didn't have opinions, he did. He wasn't big on modern technology. He was a book guy. Like, remember, this is a literature professor. The most absurd thing was when people would say he was the enemy of the book. Nothing could be further from the truth. But his religion did play a very big role in his life. However, it wasn't everything. Not everything came back to it. That's for sure.
I've heard him described as a Christian anarchist. Is that accurate, or where did that come from? I've heard some he had a
Christian anarchist. I'm not sure I've heard that. He was fairly conventional, really. Part of the reason he shied away from talking about it is he said, I'm not a theologian. I prefer to leave those things up to people who are better suited to it. But he was very, very devout and a very conservative, traditional, and serious Catholic. He started every day reading his Bible. In fact, reading his Bibles, plural, because I spent a year and a half documenting and inventorying his library, Marshall's library of around 6,000 volumes. And that's how I sort of got into McLuhan work, was in this task. And in his library, he had a dozen or so copies of the Bible in different languages. And when he traveled, in the hotel, you open the drawer and there's a Gideon's Bible. And he would always take one if he didn't have it in that language. He would ask first. You were encouraged to take them. The reason was the Bible is extremely Catholic. It's consistent across translations. Very, very consistent. So it's a great way to learn a language if you know the Bible well, because you already know what the words mean. You're just kind of filling in the blanks. Marshall would start his day reading the Bible in a few different languages. And the reason for this is that, well, it comes down to bias. Our languages inform very much our worldview. And we can only express what we have words to express, right? And every language is a different way of seeing, a different way of perception, and a different way of expression. So Marshall was always trying to broaden his perspective. He felt that the worst thing you can have is a point of view, because when you have a point of view, you're missing 90% of the story. So by engaging in language studies, this allowed him to broaden this perspective quite literally. And that's what he was always trying to do. Again, it comes back to the fact that our technologies, the medium is the message, means that our technologies consume us totally. They don't just affect our senses, they affect our opinions, they affect how we feel about each other, they affect what we do in the morning and at night, and how we feel about ourselves and each other. And
Not just media technology, but also like nuclear warheads and that kind of stuff too, right? Is that what he means by that?
well, this was another important contribution by Marshall was this broadening of what a technology is. You know, technology is a lot more than just our electronic devices. Marshall defined, when he was studying technology, he was studying any human innovation. Anything that humans make or do is an object of his media analysis. And so when he talks about the laws of media, he's talking about the things that are in common to everything that we do, everything humans make or do. So that applies as much to a language that we use to express as it does to a fork that we use to ingest. You know, they're all one thing. They're all media, and the message is transformation and change. You know, it's how quickly our technologies become so enmeshed in our lives that we can't do without them. If we were to turn Zoom off tomorrow, telecommunication of this nature, it would be a disaster, worse than the pandemic itself, much worse, in fact, because in the last year and a bit since we've lived in COVID land, we've doubled and tripled and quadrupled down on remote technologies, so that they've become that much more important socially and economically as well, to the point where the consequence of doing without them are existential.
Right. Yeah. You have schools, you have jobs, you have everything dependent on these. But these technologies are not sufficient because, you know, we're seeing an epidemic of parents saying that their children feel listless and detached, that there's no purpose to life because they're going on Zoom to hear the teacher teach and they can't feel connected. They don't feel like they're learning. They want to see with their friends. And the ones who do go to school, they have to stay 6 feet apart. I mean, we're in it's a very precarious time. It's bringing back things that humans haven't had to think about in a long time, like the nature of relationship and the nature of health. You know, is it healthy to lock a 90-year-old or 80-year-old away for years because, I mean, you're putting them in solitary confinement, which is a type of torture. Oh yeah, but you're keeping them alive. We're losing our minds in this moment collectively in the West, at least. And
The danger is that we forgo thinking about the consequences before we do things, you know, because we think we have no choice, and that abdicates us from our responsibility. I mean, I have young children. I have a 4-year-old and a 6-year-old, and they're in kindergarten and grade 1, respectively. Where I live, we return to school fairly quickly, I guess. But over Christmas break went from being a week and a half or whatever to 6 weeks. And so they instituted online learning to pick up the slack. And the government of Ontario, where I live, the province, recommended for my grade 1, my 6-year-old child, 240 minutes of synchronous online learning a day, 4 hours of screen time for a 6-year-old. Now, if you go on and you look at what the same government recommends as for screen time, they say no more than an hour a day of good content, as if, you know, that makes a difference. You know, content is content. But Let's give them that hour. Then they're saying that I should sit my kid down in front of a screen for 4 hours a day. And here's the thing. You look at the effect of the smartphone and screen time on our young people over the last 10 years, okay? And you look at that for, X amount of engagement and what the effect has been, this anxiety and identity stuff. Now, let's increase that volume sixfold. And are we not going to expect a sixfold increase in the consequences? It's crazy. And I think people have made an extreme error in judgment, because the fallout from this, and I use the term purposefully, is going to be enormous a couple years down the road, because we're changing our nature, and this next generation and the world will pay the price.
Yeah, it's sad. It's never seen a time where people are expected to sacrifice the young in mass
But what
for
in
the
math?
ostensible protection
But
of the old, but it's not really protecting the old, you know?
no, the difficulty is, what can we do? What choice do we have, really? I found a bit of a hack to mitigate it a little bit, is that the mandate was for the synchronous online learning, but kind of bringing it back to our earlier discussion, they didn't say that we had to have the camera on. So what I was doing was I was just dimming down the screen to nothing, so he could sit there and hear everything and participate, but he didn't have to be completely engaged the whole time. And does that mitigate things? I don't know. Hopefully a bit.
Well, that leads to a practical question for you as the leader of the McLuhan Institute, and knowing what you know from your dad and grandfather. How do you engage media with your children? I mean, that's it's such a universal a dilemma that a lot of families face. How much screen time, how much television time, what kind of television programming? People look at children when they watch TV, especially at a young age, and they look like zombified. They're just in a trance, and we just say, oh no, I can't help it. I have to. I'm busy. I have to let them do this so I can cook or do whatever I have to do, or do chores or whatever.
And listen,
I'm like, knowing what you know, tell us what you recommend. Give us your straight.
Listen, I get it, because I'm a father and the struggle is real, especially these times. We're all at our low reserves, and it's so easy to just sit them down and let them watch what they want to watch, do what they want to do. When I was a kid, my father literally, so the TV was in this like alcove under the stairs, and he literally put a door with a lock on it. And the deal was, if you want to watch a program, you have to read a book. Read an hour, you can watch a program. The thing is, as Marshall laid out in Understanding Media, technologies have psychic and social effects. So you can think about it in terms of personal and social consequences. So interaction with technologies, and this is, look, I'm not trying to be too precious. This counts for books as much as it counts for electronic devices. They just have different effects. So on the one hand, you have the personal effects, the way that our brains react and wire and rewire pathways and form themselves, the way our individual senses react. And then you have the social consequences, so the ways that neighborhoods and groups of people interact with each other and organize and reorganize. So the personal and social consequences. As far as social consequences, that's something that has to come from legislation, basically. There's not much I can do. There's a fun debate between Marshall McLuhan, Buckminster Fuller, and W.H. Auden. You can watch this on YouTube, and they're debating television. And Auden says, I don't have a television. I wouldn't dream of having one. To which Marshall replies, well, you merely suffer the consequences without enjoying any of the benefits. The fact is, whether or not I have a smartphone, I live in a society where everybody else does, and it's organized around it. So there's only so much I can do unless I want to go off and join some Mennonite society where they ban the things and whatever. But as far as personal ecology, and to me, media ecology means action. Ecology isn't about study; it's about curating and making the environment that we want or need. So, from this a long-winded way of getting to answer you, but luckily, and maybe it's part intention, maybe it's genetics, I don't know. My boys love reading. My 6-year-old is a great reader. He's obsessed with dinosaurs. So we buy him any and every book he wants. Luckily, my wife is really on board with this. Love you, Veronica. And we just, we encourage them to read, and we limit the screen time as much as possible. I mean, here's the thing. We live in the society we live in. If we shelter our children too much, we're not doing them any favors, like they're going to live in a world of computers, and, that kind of familiarity and literacy is going to be important for their life skills. But, knowing the effects of the printed word and engagement with text and literacy, knowing the kind of people that creates versus the kind of people, the kid who's handed an iPad at age 3 and allowed to just do what they want. I don't think that's, look, parenting's a tough gig. I don't want to judge anybody, but, that's not what I want for my children. And I feel it's my responsibility to prepare them as best I can for their life. Maybe they'll grow up, they'll be 16, and they'll be like, finally, and they're going to go binge and watch TV for the rest of their life. I don't know. But in the meantime, I think a lot of the onus is on us. So if you have a lot of Zoom meetings to do, suggest that you go dark, give your eyes and your brain a break, go acoustic. Apps like Clubhouse are really interesting because they're an attempt to bring social media into the acoustic world. I find that very interesting.
Yeah.
And go back to the book. I've been engaging in writing, and by writing I mean pen and paper a lot more. Just about every other day, I come out here to the office from the house, and I start my day with a poem. I write a poem, pen, pencil on paper. When I recently taught a 3-month course on understanding media, I did it from the book, and I made annotations in the page, and I read from the book. It makes a big difference. Experiment for yourself. Most people are probably used to typing. Try writing. Try it for a week. Sit down every day with a piece of paper and fill it. I don't care what you fill it with. Just let it come out of your mind. There are reasons why this will give you a different quality. Jack Kerouac said of Capote said of Kerouac, that's not writing, that's typing, because he recognized the product of the typewriter against the product of the page. I can type about 70, 80 words a minute. I can write maybe 40. Writing by hand forces your mind to slow down a little bit. It slows your thought a little bit. And that produces something different than when you just let it run out. Stream of consciousness is
closer to your soul, the graphite on the pencil or the pen, or the key clicking with your finger on it. Which one is closer to your soul?
Well, this is a question. Marshall switched his methods in the 60s, and he went from being a writer, although he always wrote, to working a lot more by conversation and dialogue. He dictated a lot of his letters to his secretary, who took them down in shorthand, because the quality, if we'd conducted this interview over email, you would have gotten much different answers from me. because I'm a much different writer than I am a speaker.
Right.
So Marshall started to, you'll notice a lot of his later books were done with co-authors. And that's not because Marshall couldn't write. He was a demon at writing. Like, he was a fantastic writer. He was a master. He was a literature professor. But he switched to this dialogue mode because of the result. So he would have sessions with his co-authors where they jammed ideas back and forth. The co-author went back and wrote it down, and then Marshall engaged in part of the editing process. Quite different results, and the reason was because he saw the change in the audience, and he was much more able to reach the audience of the day with this style of writing than with that style.
Interesting. I want to ask you, this is kind of like using our imagination. When we look at what we have today with the smartphone and the access to not only receive and view, HD video and high quality audio, but record HD video and high quality audio almost anywhere in the world, and how it changes the logic of violence, and it changes our conscience, it changes what we're able to look at in examining ourselves. I explain it like, when you had this kind of monomyth of radio and television kind of transmitting the ivory tower perspective about this is the way the world is. And now we have social media and these HD video captures and so forth, and we're live streaming police brutality. We're live streaming wars. We're live streaming hot mic incidences of sacred politicians and sacred celebrities that we had held in esteem. We're getting all these different perspectives, and it feels like if humanity is this collective body that, or in a sense like a blob, it's almost like we're able to see tiny little mirrors on our body now, and we're seeing all these imperfections that we didn't see in previous times as clear because we didn't have the decentralized media capture technology to examine those tiny imperfections that now seem so big and so dramatic. And I think that's why people are wrestling with things like, what should we call a syrup label? And in the previous time, we were wrestling with, how to stop the Holocaust. And it's like, but it feels very painful because we're seeing this, we're seeing all these imperfections, and we're seeing all these angles to what we are doing as a species. And we don't want to stop blaming. So we're double downing on what Girard would call the scapegoat mechanism, but it's not producing any catharsis. It's not producing any togetherness. So my question is, are we going to have new technology that gets us beyond where we're at now? And what does that look like? Is that going to be the Neuralink stuff, or can you imagine, do you have any ideas of what that could look like? What a new technology medium would look like, or is this the end of media technology history?
I doubt it's the end. I have great faith in human ingenuity. It's hard to imagine we'll ever, come up with a technology that's the be all and end all. I think the only instance of that might be something that manages to wipe us out completely. That's the only way it's going to end, really. Otherwise, we'll just find, our ingenuity is at once the greatest thing about us and our curse, because we're forever playing catch up with it. This is what Marshall was trying to get at, I think, with all his work, was that we don't need to be as helpless as we are. We can think things out before we put them out. And so one of the things he was trying to do in his work was to provide us with tools to be able to understand the effects of technologies so that we could make choices on the front end before we put things out, to get ahead of the curve of consequence, if you will. One of the enduring analogies he liked to use was from Edgar Allan Poe. Edgar Allan Poe was very useful to McLuhan for a few things, but one of them was his story, A Descent into the Maelstrom. And in that story, there's a sailor who, with his brother, they're out fishing one day, and in the ocean near where they live, there's this giant vortex in the sea, a giant maelstrom. And people usually avoid it because, you get sucked in, you're done. But, there was really good fishing over here. And before they knew it, they'd gone too far. And they get sucked into this giant vortex. And his brother loses his stuff and jumps, overboard, and he's done. But because of the nature of the thing is so huge, it's taking him forever to go down and down and down and down. And the sailor, being of a disposition, just starts to look around and see what's happening, right, as he's being flushed down the toilet. And he notices that certain objects, instead of going down, are going up. It's like, oh. He investigates a little more, and he discovers that there's a pattern to it. So he straps himself to a chest or whatever he had there, and he times it right, and he leaps into it, jumps out of his ship, and he's carried up out of the vortex and washes up ashore, and he's saved. And Marshall used that as an analogy for a technological circumstance, that the advantage of the time that we're in, when things happen so fast, we don't have time to adjust, is the advantage there is that we can notice the patterns. Hopefully that will lead to smarter design choices, so that we can make our technologies with fewer side effects, let's say. The side effects generally is where they get you. You watch a commercial for a new drug, and you see somebody frolicking in the field in slow motion. And meanwhile, in the background, this guy's telling you how you're going to lose your hair and your bladder's going to fall out and all the rest of it. It's the side effects that get you, right? But let's just concentrate on frolicking in the field. By another analogy, somebody said, if they only raised the temperature of the bath water 0.5 degree an hour, you wouldn't know when to scream. So back when technologies were really slow, we didn't have the time to notice what was going on. We got used to it. The blessing and the curse of today is that we don't have time to adjust. The bad part of that is that it just keeps hitting us over and over and over. We just get kind of used to something, and bam, we get hit by something else. But that's where the hope lies, in that we can start to notice patterns and realize that, look, we create these things. Why not create them instead to optimize the nabbing of attention? Let's optimize them for peacefulness, for satisfaction, for other things, which
you're not talking about the content there. You're talking about the actual technology, right?
Yeah. What happens while we're busy watching the content? That's what we need to be paying.
We need
attention.
smell-o-vision.
Yeah.
Is that the sense that we need to bring back into the forefront to be able to, since that's the primal sense that you never get to enjoy,
Maybe. I've wondered about that. Actually, I'm kind of waiting for them to be able to synthesize smell. It's probably a good thing. To be honest, I didn't bother putting on deodorant before this interview.
Sure.
You wouldn't have known if I didn't say anything.
Right.
Obviously, I haven't had my hair cut in a while, but yeah.
Smell, is that the sense that's been scapegoated by all of our technologies because we just don't know how to bring it back with us, and that maybe that's what we need,
I'm sure we'll figure it out before long, and God help us. But as for where it all ends,
watching television, you smell the orange. They do this at theme parks and stuff. Like in Disney's, they have the ride in Epcot called Soarin'. Have you ever been on it?
No.
And you get in this thing and it floats up in the air, and you smell ocean water when you go over the ocean in this big dome, and then you see the smell of grass, and then you smell orange groves, and you smell the orange blossoms, and you feel the wind on your face. As a McLuhan, you would really enjoy that experience, the total experience of being up in the air and feeling wind and mist when you go over a cloud. And
interesting.
Yeah.
Well, that really goes toward this idea that we're craving more and more and more sensory input. there's a reason why they put a pan of cookies in the house before you come look at it to buy it, because it does something to you, right? Marshall, I think, said at the start of Understanding Media that we're rapidly approaching the final phase of the extensions of man. He called technologies extensions of man because, as I said before, all our technologies extend or amplify something. Who was it that said the body is the magazine of inventions? That's kind of where this, Mumford, I think it was, where this idea of extensions of man comes from. Marshall said we're rapidly approaching the final phase of the extensions of man, and that's the synthesizing of consciousness. And I think, humanity kind of emerged from the spell of the animal world, because what people do that animals don't seem to do is have an awareness of themselves as separate. Animals don't so much do that, and I think we're slowly going back the other way. This idea of the individual consciousness. So Marshall, I think, felt that the final phase of the extensions of man, the last thing we have to synthesize, is our consciousness. And maybe we're starting to get there with things like the Internet of Things and machine learning and artificial intelligence. I don't think we're quite there yet. Maybe these Neuralink experiments and downloading your consciousness to the net are a step in that direction.
Yeah, you need to talk to Elon Musk, because he's really worried about these AI.
Yeah. You know what? I would
coming out of the beast.
I would love to talk to Elon Musk. He on Instagram, his Instagram account, he put up a picture of Marshall McLuhan last summer, and people thought he had put up a picture of Nikola Tesla because they look a little bit alike. Actually, Poe does too, for that matter. Later in a tweet, he said the medium is the message. Musk did. So this is very interesting. Elon Musk seems to have some awareness that there was this person called Marshall McLuhan. I'm not sure. I haven't seen much evidence that he understands anything Marshall did. If he did, it would drastically change the way that he approached his work. I know this fairly well, so I would love to talk to Elon.
How would it change, or what would it? I mean, just to sketch out the implications of that work.
I don't think Mr. Musk has the understanding of the personal and social consequences of technologies. I think he's got his eye more on the prize. For example, I don't think anybody has really thought out what the effect of circling the planet in hundreds, 1,000 or so connected satellites beaming internet onto us is going to have. I don't think anybody's thought that through. Maybe we should.
You mean like our physical health from that?
Our physical health, our mental health, our sensorial lives. What is that going to mean? It's probably a good idea to think about these things before we do them, but it hasn't really been the human way to think about the consequences. We're more, Sir Edmund Hillary, who, oh, look, there's a mountain. Let's climb it, see what happens. I'd be very interested to talk to Elon Musk about that. I'm convinced that if the people in charge of the major innovations put more thought into these psychic and social effects, we would have a different world, and more likely a better, objectively better world, all said and done.
Would you not would that make them not do those innovations, and then other people who didn't read McLuhan would do them, and then to do bad things with it, though? You know what I mean?
Well, I'm all for regulations. I'm for smart design and smart regulation. I'm a writer as well. I'm a poet. I dabble in art and music, and constraint is a vital part of the creative process. the most difficult thing to face is a blank page. It's good to have a few constraints in order to head you off in a direction. Without any regulation, we're free to succeed or fail, and there's something to be said for that. But when we're talking about people's lives and their sensorial makeup, I think there's a different burden. And not to get too moral on it, but I'd rather live in a world where people were happier than angrier, to put it in those kind of terms. And I think we can, just in the way that we can design drugs with fewer side effects, or different side effects, I think we can design technologies. We just don't have any incentive to do so. Right now, the main incentive behind designing technologies is for profits, largely driven by advertisers, people who want to sell things. So the technologies are designed to monopolize your attention, and to hold your attention. We don't necessarily have to design with that as our goal. We could possibly think about designing technologies that, instead of making us distracted, make us focused.
How likely is it in 2040 that we'll be using smartphone type devices as our main medium of communication and interaction and so forth, and understanding of the world?
I mean, that's far enough ahead. I could say anything and have a pretty good,
2030. Okay. I just like to look at, I like to think like Steve Jobs, in that sense of, he looks at TV, he looks at these phones, and he figures out a way to say, hey, how about we just make this work, and then you just improve iterations after iterations. And I like to think,
right,
what's that next thing going to be that we're going to be like, oh, that was hidden right in plain sight. How come we didn't think about doing that with that? It was just all there. We just needed to glue it together,
Not
as a
that
mental
I'm
exercise to stretch our imagination,
not that I'm a futurist, or I spend an awful lot of time thinking about it, but I think we've spent a lot of our time developing technologies that take us outside of our bodies, that take the things that we do ourselves and bring them out. So, and I think we're slowly heading in the opposite direction. I think we're starting to move more and more inside us. And at the moment, that's looking extreme things like implants and nanobots and neural networks and all this stuff. I think there might be more organic solutions. One thing that you learn from McLuhan studies is that is about obsolescence. Okay, and these are the obsolescence that we learned, perhaps, that obsolescence, as Marshall said, never meant the death of anything. Obsolescence is the matrix of innovation. So whenever we create something new, television didn't kill radio. It changed radio. It turned radio into more of an art form. And technologies seem to have that effect on the older technologies. So are we going to move toward a society without smartphones? Possibly. I think we're going to find different ways, less cumbersome ways to do that probably bring things inside ourselves more. I think we're starting to head toward the amplification of our innate processes more than outsourcing them. What that will ultimately look like, we'll have to wait and see.
Well, it's been a real pleasure talking with you, Andrew, and I really enjoyed this time, and I have many more questions and thoughts that we'll have to pick up on another time. And but for now, I want to give people a place where can they continue to follow and engage your work.
Oh, thank you. It's really been a pleasure, this discussion. Thank you, David. I conduct the McLuhan Institute is pretty much a one-person operation right now, but I share a lot of what I'm doing, the things I come across on Twitter. If you search for the McLuhan Institute, I put a lot of the quotes and things that you don't generally see from McLuhan studies there. It's more than just the medium is the message. And on Instagram, the McLuhan Institute, I put up interesting things I find around the office here. This was my father's office. He died coming up on 3 years ago, and now it's mine, I guess. Instagram, Twitter, Facebook. I have a YouTube channel with juicy tidbits, and even a podcast, The Massage by the McLuhan Institute. Or just go to the McLuhaninstitute.com, and that's where you can find what I'm up to.
Well, very good. Again, it's a pleasure, and we'll continue these conversations.
Thank you.